If you need ideas on where to begin making your own unique model of a horse or how to finish it, then welcome. I'd love to share my favorite process for sculpting horses in clay with basic materials. This is everything I wish I would have known before I started sculpting horses. I wish I would have learned right away how much easier it is to sculpt with a support armature for the clay. I now make mine from galvanized steel wire from hardware stores as it's budget-friendly, stiff enough to hold a lot of weight, and yet not so stiff I'm unable to bend it with my fingers. A set of basic pliers helps bend anything that might be tricky with just my hands, and makes bends for joints much faster. I often wrap thinner jewelry wire along the legs to help my clay stick. I use aluminum foil from a grocery store as a budget-friendly way to bulk up the armature. This adds more support, sort of lets me start sculpting using the foil, and because the shape is begun, I can use less clay, so that's a cost savings too. Other options for bulking are tape, paper, foam, or spray foam, provided they work with the clay of choice. For example, if I'm using clay that requires baking in a kiln or oven, that will limit my options. If you're bulking up the armature, then it's time for my first tip. Always start with the profile first, and then add the width or the volume second. When you start with the clay, start again with the side of the animal first, then the volume. This process just makes sculpting a lot easier. Also, focus on the big picture shapes first, rather than tiny details. So, think about the outline first, and save thinking about things such as hair strands or veining for later. I often squint at both my sculptures and my references, or squint at real animals I get to see in person to help me visualize the big picture shapes. Once I feel like my sculpture matches what I see when I squint, then I start working on the details. Speaking of good support for your clay, let's talk clay options. I'm going to share a few brands, and they all fall under one of two types of clays. Permanent, which cures hard, or reusable, which is a soft clay that never hardens. Let's talk about the permanent options. First are epoxy putties from brands like Milliput, Green Stuff, Aves Epoxy, Magisculpt, and Freeform. This type of clay-like material cures on its own within a few hours after you mix the two different parts, and so it's solid, permanent, and paintable. You can also sand, drill, and carve them after they cure. Epoxy putties are available in sizes like 4 ounces, 1 pound, or even 16 pounds. Next are polymer clays like Sculpting, Cosclay, Kato, Cernet, and Fimo. Depending on where you live, polymer clay might be easier to find than epoxy putty. Polymer clays come in sizes like 1 to 2 ounces or 1 pound. They remain uncured and soft until you bake them in an oven. After that, you can usually drill, sand, carve, and paint most of them. Remember to wear a dust mask, goggles, and work outside or in a well-ventilated area when sanding, drilling, and carving clays to avoid the dust particles. And finally, let's talk about the reusable, non-hardening clays such as plastilina from brands like Van Haken, Sargent Art, Monster Clay, Chavant, and Alien Clay. These clays never cure hard and can't be baked in an oven or kiln, and they'll just melt. Because they never harden, they're reusable though, which makes them great for practicing. The only downside is if you want a permanent copy of your sculpture to paint, you'll need to learn mold making and casting, learn 3D scanning and printing, or find someone who can do all of that for you. Most all of these clays come with their own set of instructions for how to properly use them, so always read product instructions and buy the right accessories those instructions call for, like gloves. You can often find these clays from online retailers or in stores like art supply stores, Blick, Michaels, Hobby Lobby, and Reynolds Advanced Materials, to name a few. Of course, there are many other types of clay out there, like air dry clay and ceramic clays, which you can research. I chose to talk about epoxy putties, polymer clay, and plastilina in this video as they're what I'm most experienced in and what I feel are beginner-friendly clays for sculpting your own model of a horse using the techniques I'm demonstrating. I'm always trying new materials, so if you want to see what it's like to sculpt with a different clay, subscribe as I might try it for my own art adventures. And my channel is where you can find more of my horse sculpting projects as well as animals in painting, printmaking, and more. Speaking of materials, let me share some favorite basic tools and supplies for beginners. First off, something to sculpt with like your own fingers, toothpicks, rubber tip clay shapers, ribbon tools, embossing tools, wax carving tools, or dental tools. Now, you don't need all of these all at once. Your fingers and a simple pointed tool, like even a toothpick, will get you started on a budget and are really all you need at first. Add more as you go. You can use your hands and different tools to shape and smooth the clay, so experiment to find what's right for you. Some clays can also smooth with water, and some need a solvent like isopropyl alcohol, so check your clay instructions and remember to use solvent with gloves in a well-ventilated area if you choose to use it. Well-fitting gloves like nitrile gloves are a must with mini clays, so check your instructions. It can be a little tricky to get used to, yet sculpting with gloves is entirely possible. For myself, it was a bit of a learning curve, but it's pretty easy now, and gloves make cleanup easier. Speaking of cleanup, old rags or blue shop towels are great. I find the blue towels are great at smoothing epoxy putties like Milliput when dampened with a little water. I found that trick to be a lifesaver when sculpting with gloves. Let's get back to sculpting tips. After you've blocked in the general shape of the horse, my next biggest tip is to begin refining it and adding detail with small pieces of clay at a time. Building up realism in smaller pieces rather than one area all at once is often easier for a beginner. For example, I found it easier when I was a beginner to sculpt muzzles with several pieces of noodle-shaped clay, slowly shaping them into the details of a horse muzzle rather than trying to carve those details out from a big blob of clay. It's still possible to carve it all out, and in fact this is known as subtractive sculpting. It just can be a higher learning curve for sculpting horses for the first time. So if you find yourself struggling with that, try building up areas with smaller pieces of clay instead. Sculpting long hair details like manes and tails is also often easier using smaller pieces of noodle-shaped clay. Add hairlines with a pointed tool, smooth with a soft paintbrush, and add in lines again, smooth and repeat until you get the amount of detail you're happy with. It's actually fairly common for sculpting techniques to be a back and forth process like this, so try things out until you find the process that works. Take your time, always have references handy to help you, and remember, you can always take clay off and start over if a detail looks different than you hoped. And if you're finding this helpful so far, I'd love to hear it. Or you could give that like button a little boop like it's a pony's snoot. Speaking of references, let me share my favorites to help get you started right away. If you want to sculpt realistic horses, learning anatomy will really help, and I love using Herman Dittrich's horse anatomy charts, which are old veterinary diagrams that are still really accurate to this day. You can find them online at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's website, linked below, or in this book, An Atlas of Animal Anatomy for Artists, compiled by Ellenberger. Speaking of books, Jillian Higgins has some really nice ones of painting anatomy on real horses, and there's a companion YouTube channel where you can see those horses moving in action. It's linked below. If you choose a hard-curing clay like epoxy putty or baked polymer clay, you could choose to finish your horses with paint like acrylics, oils, or any paint that sticks well to a smooth, rigid surface. I like to lightly sand and spray a primer on my sculptures before painting so the paint sticks well and lasts for many years. I also spray with a varnish sealer after for added protection against scratches, sun damage, or finger oils. If you choose a non-hardening clay like plastilina, you could choose to recycle it into a new sculpture or make a copy to paint using the molding and casting process or 3D scanning and printing. Mold making or 3D printing are their own art adventures. Since I'm still teaching myself those methods, I've linked to resources I found helpful in my own journey in case you want a starting point for your own research. My final tip is what I wish I would have heard years ago. Just start. Begin the clay adventure and focus on the joy of creation. It's beautiful that we can bring our imaginations to life and share them with the world. I know a lot of us value perfection, and to that I gently remind you, every piece is a testament to your creativity, and each one makes the world more beautiful, even the imperfect ones. So take the first step. Give yourself permission to try, play, and grow. You might discover your creation exceeds your expectations. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one, and with that, I'll thank you so much for watching, and I'll let you get back to your day. Bye!